If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. There are parts of my job that I absolutely love. And one of those is hearing from people who have been considering Catholicism, whether it's from this podcast because they write into me, or people that I meet who've been listening, or they've been investigating Catholicism through other sources. When they come and say, I've considered it, I've been on this road to Rome, and I'm ready to walk across the bridge over the Tiber, the OCIA bridge. And also kind of in my day job at my parish where I run the OCIA program, I'll get emails from people drop by and say, I've been walking the road to Rome for a while and I'm ready to do it. I'm ready to do it. I want to sign up for OCIA. That's one of my favorite parts of my job or jobs, either my day job or doing this podcast. One of the least favorite parts of my job, I would almost go so far as to say part of my job that I really, really hate. I don't know, hate's too strong of a word, because in the end, helping people to discover the truth in their life is not something to be hated. It's something that God wants us to do. But it's the least fun part of my job is when I talk to those people and I say, okay, you want to enter OCIA? Or they write me and say, I've tried to enter OCIA at my parish, and they had me fill out a questionnaire. And in the questionnaire, they asked if I had had any previous marriages. And then this conversation takes place where the person says, well, yeah, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever, I was married, and then I got divorced, and I got remarried. And now I'm happily in my second marriage, and I want to enter the Catholic Church. Sometimes I and my spouse want to enter the Catholic Church. And this is where I really don't have any fun. Because what I'll have to say to them is, hold on, the church is going to need to examine that first marriage. They're going to have to figure out whether or not that first marriage was valid. And that's going to make a difference, because if it is determined by the church that it was valid, then you cannot enter the Catholic Church with the sacraments of confirmation and the Eucharist. And then they'll say, well, wait a minute, hold on. That was years ago. And it was in a Protestant church. I wasn't Catholic. My spouse wasn't Catholic. Maybe it wasn't even in a Protestant church. They'll say that was years ago. And we went to a ski resort and we got married by the renta minister at a ski resort. And when that marriage went bad, I went to my Protestant pastor and said, look, this marriage is really going bad. My spouse is cheating on me, or whatever the case may be. And my Protestant pastor or evangelical church pastor advised me to get a divorce, even said I should. And so I did. And then sometime after that, I met a wonderful new person, and we decided to get married. And I went to my Protestant pastor, my evangelical church pastor, or whatever, and said, hey, we want to get married. And we did pre-marriage counseling. And my Protestant or evangelical church pastor blessed that second marriage, celebrated it, and now I'm happily remarried. Again, either in a Protestant church, non-denominational church, whatever. We went to the ski resort, or we went to Cancun, or we got married at the beach by somebody. And so we didn't think that that would require an annulment, right? You only need an annulment for a Catholic marriage, or if the people were Catholic. The Protestant or evangelical or civil marriage doesn't require the Catholic Church to annul it, does it? For a Protestant wedding? It wasn't in a Catholic church. Neither of us was Catholic back then. And I get emails like this all the time. And I encounter people who want to enter OCIA all the time with this question. And they're confused. They're heartbroken. Why does the Catholic Church care about a marriage that wasn't even Catholic? And why can't a civil divorce just close that chapter of my life? Now, all of this came up again in the last couple of days because those of you who are regular listeners know that we've been following along the journey, escapades of Ed the Protestant, and he shared a few episodes ago that he finally got his annulment. And I had listeners email me after that and say, wait, why did Ed the Protestant have to even go through the annulment process if it was in a Protestant church, the first marriage, and a Protestant pastor blessed the second marriage? How is that any of the Catholic Church's business? So what I want to do in this episode is answer this question clearly, definitively, try to make sense out of it. So let's just set the stage clearly. When someone wants to join the Catholic Church through OCIA, the Order of Christian Initiation of Adults, the parish is always going to ask about their marital history. They're going to ask, are you married now? Have you ever been divorced and remarried? And it's not just because they're nosy or busybodies or whatever. It's because marriage, in the church's eyes, is a big deal. It's a lifelong bond that doesn't just vanish because you got a civil divorce. And again, you've all been following along with Ed the Protestant on this show for the last couple of years, and you've seen how sincere he is. And Ed has been real transparent about it. He said, look, my old church was fine with my divorce. I know his old church, and I know his old pastor. And his old pastor advised him to get a divorce. And his old pastor approved his second marriage. And his old pastor performed the second marriage with the endorsement of the elders of his Protestant church. But then the Catholic Church comes along and says, well, that divorce that you got doesn't count. And the current marriage is, quote, irregular, meaning in the view of the Catholic Church, that first bond is still in effect. And so Ed or anyone else can't receive confirmation of the Eucharist until the Catholic Church sorts all of that out through the annulment process. And it's a gut punch. I have had a half dozen people just in the last 3 or 4 weeks get a hold of me, so excited to enter the Catholic Church because of the road to Rome, listening to this show, other things, and just feel gut punched that they had this marriage 20 years earlier and the Catholic Church is holding up its hand, standing on the OCIA bridge saying, you shall not pass until we resolve the first marriage. And they're thinking, I'm trying to follow Jesus here. I'm trying to find truth, goodness, and beauty in the church. And now I'm stuck in paperwork for a year and a half over a marriage from 20 years ago. It was just two Protestants in a church, or maybe a quick civil ceremony at the courthouse or at the beach or at a resort. No Catholics involved, no Catholic church, no Catholic priest. So why does the church still require an annulment? And some Catholics write me and say, I thought that annulments were only for Catholic weddings, but here's the spoiler, that's not how it works. The answer is yes, the church still does need to examine that prior marriage, whether it was Protestant, civil, or on a beach at sunset with the rent-a-minister. So let's dig into why. The Catholic Church takes marriage so seriously that it assumes that any marriage, Protestant, civil, whatever, is valid and binding until proven otherwise. And this comes straight from the Code of Canon Law, the Church's legal rule book. So Canon 1059 says that even marriages between non-Catholics are subject to the church's oversight when someone wants to enter the church. Canon 1060 is crystal clear. It says, quote, "Marriage possesses the favor of law. Consequently, a valid matrimonial contract is presumed to exist until the contrary is proven." In other words, the church starts with a, yes, that marriage counts until a tribunal investigates and says otherwise. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB, puts it plainly, quote, "The Catholic Church respects the marriages of non-Catholics and presumes that they are valid. Thus, for example, it considers the marriages of two Protestant, Jewish, or even non-believing persons to be binding for life." This is in their annulment FAQ on their website. The Diocese of Savannah's tribunal echoes this on their website when they say that the presumption is that a marriage is valid whether it was done before a judge or a minister of another faith. And canon law expert Dr. Edward Peters sums it up this way: "If a Protestant convert wants to join the church but is divorced and remarried, the church requires an annulment of that prior marriage before moving forward." Now, just a little side question. What about baptism? So if someone's unbaptized and in an irregular marriage, can they start OCIA as a catechumen and then just get baptism, but not get confirmation in the Eucharist? Well, it is possible for a person to enter into the OCIA instructional process. In other words, go to the classes, but they will not be able to go through with their sacraments of initiation until the first marriage question is resolved. I know this all just sounds like bureaucracy, but it's not. It's about protecting something sacred. Of course, that raises the question, why does the church care so much about a non-Catholic marriage? And that brings us to a deeper question. Hey, I just want to take a moment to say that your support keeps this thing going. Look, this show is 100% listener supported. We don't run advertisements. And so if it's helped answer your questions or deepen your faith or moved you along the road to Rome, like it has for so many people that I hear from, would you click the PayPal donate button in the show notes or on the website at consideringcatholicism.com. Together, you and I, we can educate, equip, and excite more people about historic Catholic Christianity. All right, we've got the what. The church says, no, you can't just wave away a prior marriage with a civil divorce, even if it was Protestant or civil. But why? Is this just some dusty rule in canon law, or is there a bigger reason? Now, as a former Protestant, I can tell you that this really clicked for me when I remembered what St. Paul says in the book of Romans chapter 1, when he says, "What can be known about God is plain to them," meaning the pagan world, "because God has shown it ever since the creation of the world." So in that whole chapter, Paul is talking about the truths that are sort of woven into the fabric of reality, baked into the cake from the beginning, truths that we all know deep down, whether we're Catholic or not, whether really Paul says we're Christian or not. And in Catholicism, we call this natural law. So what is natural law? Well, it's the idea that God built a moral order into the creation itself, like a blueprint for how humans are supposed to live, and that is written in the creation and on every heart naturally. It's not something that the church made up. It's something that we can discover by reason, because he said we're made in God's image, and we can read those things that God has built naturally into the universe through our natural mind. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church, I think, nails it. It says, quote, "The natural law present in the heart of each man and established by reason is universal, and its principal precepts are expressed in the Decalogue." That's the 10 Commandments. You could find that in Catechism, paragraph 1955. So in other words, there's this universal right and wrong that is hardwired into us. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of civilization's greatest thinkers, said it like this: the first precept of law is that good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. All other precepts are based upon this. So in other words, right and wrong are the foundation of reality, and everything is built on top of it. St. Augustine, another great doctor of the church, put it a little more poetically. He said, "Your law is written in the hearts of men, which iniquity itself effaces not." That's from Augustine's Confessions. So, metaphors. One metaphor that's used for this a lot is the idea of gravity, right? You don't need to be a physicist. You don't need to be Sir Isaac Newton to know that if you jump off a roof, you're going to fall, right? I mean, you can just observe that. That's just part of the natural order. And natural law is like that, but for morality. So it's how we're built. So going back to Romans chapter 1, this is what Paul is talking about. In verses 19 and 20, he says that God has made it plain, like the natural law, so that we're, quote, without excuse when we ignore it. And even as a Protestant, I could see that. Actually, reflection upon what Paul was saying in Romans 1 was one of the steps on my own road to Rome, away from Calvinism. But Paul is arguing that some truths are self-evident. There is no Bible or Pope required. As an aside, that's actually the argument that Thomas Jefferson makes, right, in the Declaration of Independence, that we hold certain truths to be self-evident. Now, how does all of this apply to marriage? Well, marriage isn't just a Catholic thing. It's a human thing, and it's rooted in the creation order. So Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 through 28 says, "Male and female he created them, to be fruitful and to multiply." That's the natural state of marriage. Male and female, fruitful and multiplying. Genesis 2:24 unpacks it even more. It says, "A man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And then Jesus doubles down on this in Matthew 19:6. He says, "What God has joined together, let no one separate." And here's the wild part. In Catholicism, marriage is unique among the other sacraments because the priest doesn't make the sacrament happen. The spouses do themselves when they give their free and total consent to each other before God. The priest or the minister is just the witness of it. The Catechism in paragraph 1623 confirms this. It says, quote, "The spouses mutually confer upon each other the sacrament by expressing their consent before the church," unquote. So even a non-Catholic marriage can hit this threshold of sacramentality. If two baptized Protestants exchange vows with real intent, so an intent for fidelity, for permanence, for openness to life, then it's not just a natural bond, it's a sacramental bond. It's elevated by grace, even if they don't call it that because they don't have that language. A civil marriage between non-believers, who go to the resort or Vegas or whatever, it can still be a natural bond under God's design and binding unless proven otherwise. So Aquinas backs this up. He says, besides divine authority, logic and nature clearly show that marriage is permanent and indissoluble. And so that's why the church doesn't just shrug and say, "Oh, well, it wasn't a Catholic wedding, so no big deal." Because it's about what God has wired into creation. At a certain level, we all grasp natural law. So take something that hopefully we can all agree on, like raping children, right? Horrible sexual abuse and mutilation and rape of children, right? Most horrid things you can imagine. Why is that evil? Not just because canon law or the Bible says so, but because it violates how humans are made. It violates the natural law, the deep law that God built into the foundations of the universe. We should know that, Paul says in Romans 1, at a gut level. And if your culture, your civilization has gotten to a point where it doesn't recognize that child abuse of that horrific nature is wrong, then your civilization has lost its gut level natural awareness of right and wrong. Again, that's what Paul says in Romans chapter 1. Look at verses 26 through 27 when he talks about unnatural acts and how he defines unnatural acts. And basically what he's talking about there is things that, let's just say that our culture promotes very freely. Go back and read Romans 1, 26 through 27. I'll do a whole episode on that at some point. But look, the same is true with murder or stealing or any other number of things. It's not wrong because it's on the books. It's on the books because it's wrong. And that's baked into the cake of creation. And marriage is the same way. So when two people vow to become one flesh, God takes that seriously. A civil divorce might end the legal contract, the civil contract between them, how they divide up the money and all that kind of thing. But the church says that the spiritual bond, the one flesh, doesn't vanish unless it was never there to begin with, because that vow was never a valid vow. So, when you show up for OCIA, the church has to ask you, was that first marriage a real valid bond? Even if it was two Protestants or two atheists at a courthouse, it might have met God's threshold: free consent, intent for permanence, openness to kids. If it did, then it is a binding bond, and a second marriage would be, quote, irregular. I hate to say this, but what Jesus calls adulterous in Matthew 19:9. But if that first marriage lacked some essential quality, like one spouse who never intended fidelity, or they were coerced, or any number of other criteria that we've talked about on the show in other episodes, then the church can declare that first marriage null, like in null and void, meaning that it never was a true marriage. And then the current marriage, the second marriage, can stand, and that person is free to enter the church fully, receiving confirmation in Eucharist. And if you've been following along over the last 4 years on Ed the Protestant's, journey, adventures, I would say, if he was sitting here, I'd say adventures or escapades, then you know how he felt about that. And there's just thousands of others in the same situation. He said, I was kind of mad and frustrated at first, but digging into it, it forced me to confront things that I didn't want to confront. And as he shared the other day, he's at peace now because he wanted to know the truth. If you listen to that episode, he said, I just wanted to hear an authority, and there is no greater authority than the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, just telling me the truth. And that's the mercy here, is to tell the truth. It's not about punishment. It's about making sure that you're free, not half tangled up in the past. The church isn't trying to gatekeep. It's guarding a truth about how God made us, a truth that applies whether you were married in a cathedral or a county clerk's office or at the Elvis wedding chapel in Vegas, all right? So, anyway, the church does require an annulment for any prior marriage, Protestant, civil, whatever, because of natural law, the way that God wired marriage into creation. Canon law unpacks it. Genesis, Jesus, and Paul explain why. It's not about an obsession with rules. It's about entering the church wholly free, ready for the sacraments. And so, if you're out there and this is your story, don't let it discourage you. Talk to your priest. This is part of the beauty of one church that stretches across 20 centuries, 24 time zones, 2 hemispheres, is that we are a giant community of God and a giant community of grace, and the truths that God put forth the things that he shared with his apostles and said, Matthew 28, go into all nations and make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And behold, I'm with you unto the very end of the age. That's what the church is trying to do. And in closing, it occurred to me when I was putting the notes together for this episode that in nearly 400 episodes, so we're approaching the 400th anniversary episode. Ed the Protestant and I recorded a 400th anniversary episode the other day. They'll air in a week or two. I realized as I look back to the archives, I've never done a deep dive just on the topic of natural law. And I'm realizing that that's a gap because it's such a core piece of how Catholicism understands the world. And so it's probably time that we unpack it more. I may need to do a deep dive series or a course or something on natural law. So stay tuned. There might be something coming about that. So for now, keep considering Catholicism. Don't be discouraged, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon. But before you go, can I quickly ask you to do 5 things? First, please rate the podcast on whatever platform you listen on. That really moves it up in search rankings. Second, please write a review on either Apple Podcasts or on our website, consideringcatholicism.com. That encourages others who are searching for a Catholic podcast to try this one out. Third, please share it with others. Send them a link or post an episode on your social media. Fourth, please write me at consideringcatholicism.com or leave a comment on our website. I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, and your stories. And finally, this podcast is 100% donor supported. My donors keep me going, they help cover my costs, and they let me dedicate more time to researching, writing, recording, and editing to get the episodes out to you faster. So please consider giving a one-time or recurring donation through the links in the show notes or on the website so that this ministry can continue and grow. And never forget, Christus vincit, Christus regnat, and Christus imperat.